Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It is exactly 9:57 a.m. and our final interview for the morning, a very important one indeed. When I saw that we were having Dr. Salim Parker on air this morning to talk about tips for preventing heat-related illness, I kind of thought it was no big deal because I thought, really, shouldn't we know that kind of stuff? And common sense would prevail till I read that people actually die from heat-related illnesses and obviously heat stroke. So let's unpack this very important issue, very especially since we are undergoing a heat wave here in South Africa. Dr. Salim Parker, Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And shukran for the invitation. And I like your introduction because a lot of people actually underestimate the effect of heat, and especially with climate change. But just to put it in perspective, we all know about Hajj. So let's start with that. In 1985, there were 2,000 cases of heat stroke during the Hajj because it was in the summer months. That was in August. 2,000 cases of heat stroke. 50% of those people passed away. Over 1,000 of them passed away due to heat stroke. So it is a serious medical issue. Just last year, for example, Europe had one of its hottest summers on record, and more than 26,000 people died because of heat-related illnesses. Common thing. Let's look at what happened in the last few days in Kakamas in South Africa, close to Uppington. We know there's a heat wave where the temperature's averaging about 40 degrees at its peak.
Sure.
More than eight people so far have been confirmed to have died during this current heat wave. And if things continue as they are with load shedding, for example, which precludes people from using the most common things that we use to treat heat-related illnesses, the numbers might just rise. So inshallah, the interventions that have been put in place by the health authorities in the Northern Cape will stop further people from passing away. It is a serious medical problem.
Okay, so Dr. Parker, how does one kind of recognize the signs and symptoms of, a possible heat-related illness or possibly even heat stroke? We kind of take it for granted because we live in a typically, we have hot summers and we have more sunshine than possibly any other country in the world, I should imagine. So we kind of take this for granted. What should we be looking out for and how do we protect ourselves?
Right. Firstly, we can't really we need to be aware of the possibility of it happening. But normally we should be more acutely aware of it if the temperatures are higher than normal. 40 degrees in the Northern Cape is not the norm. So clearly the people are going to be more exposed to heat, and this makes them more susceptible to it. The problem with the symptoms of it, it's very what we call non-specific. People, for example, initially might just have cramps, easily treatable by taking water or just some electrolyte solution. Energy drinks, for example, is a common thing that we can use for that. But the symptoms that are more serious, for example, we talk about heat exhaustion, tiredness, is when people get headaches, they have muscle cramps, they have stomach pains, very non-specific. Might be a bit confused. They might also just say they're sweating, they're tired, they're hot. And those are the signs of heat exhaustion, and that's easy to treat. What we do is we get people out of the the hot areas. We try to make sure that they're not dehydrated because enough fluid in your body is important to prevent the heat exhaustion. So if people are dehydrated, they have a much higher chance of getting heat stroke and heat exhaustion. So it's important, firstly, to get a person who's heat exhausted to a cool area. Make sure that they're taking enough fluids. It doesn't necessarily have to be a balanced electrolyte one. As long as it's water or any other fluid intake, it's important. What we can also do is to sponge them down with a light sponge. But we have to just remember two things. The way we control our body temperatures is to firstly radiate heat out. So if we exercising or we're outside in the heat, we radiate the heat out, and that's how we regulate our body temperature. But if the temperature outside is more than 35, it doesn't really work. The second way we lose heat is to sweat. But it's not just sweating and the water's on your skin. No, that's just getting the heat to the skin. We must actually get it away from the skin by evaporation. So if the outside temperature is high and it is quite humid, you're sweating, but the sweat is not being evaporated. So that's the second part of to take into consideration when we talk about how to treat people. And so if someone is heat exhausted, like I've mentioned, get them into a cool area, sponge them down, make sure they take enough fluids in, and also try to get the fan close to them so that you can actually get the sweat off them. So if you sponge them down, the fan will then get rid of the fluid on there, evaporating the fluid and cooling the body down. So this has been the problem in the Northern Cape currently. It's high temperatures, humidity is also high, but they've got water shortages. Never said there's not a water shortage. Yes, there is a water shortage because there is load shedding. For people to access water on farms, for example, they need pumps to get the water to them. And if there's load shedding, they can't access the water. And this has been implicated in some of the deaths. Secondly, as I've just mentioned, you want to use a fan to evaporate the water, either that you sponged them with or the sweat on them. If you can't use a fan because there's a electrical shortage because of load shedding, you can't use that particular method as well. Thirdly, you can put ice packs under their armpits, under their neck, cover obviously the ice packs under with some cloth so it doesn't irritate the skin. You could put it under the elbows, in the neck, behind the neck, in the groin areas itself. But again, if you do not have electricity to form ice in refrigerators, you're sitting with a problem. And this combination of factors has led to the number of deaths in the Northern Cape. So how do we prevent? I've mentioned some of the treatment for heat exhaustion already. Prevention is make sure that you're well hydrated, make sure that you're in a cool area when it's so hot outside. Do not work outside and this because it's harvest season in the Northern Cape currently.
Of
People
course.
are trying to get as much of the fruit off the trees as possible. So do not work during the peak hours of sunshine. And then the three L's: light clothing, loose clothing, so there's circulation of it, and also light colored clothing, so that it reflects the light and not absorb white reflects light, black absorbs light. So those are the preventative measures as far as heat exhaustion is concerned. Heat stroke, like I've mentioned, can lead to a 50% mortality. That is much more
Sure.
serious. It's a medical emergency. So the first thing to do is to try to get a patient to hospital, any hospital, and hopefully the hospital will have generators to implement some of the strategies that I just mentioned already. Whilst on the way to hospital, try to cool down the person by using a fan, for example that I've mentioned, ice packs under the arms, as much cool fluids as necessary. It doesn't always have to be cold fluids. It can be cool. We don't advise people to drink copious amounts of ice liquids. Again, the implementation of the ice packs, like I've mentioned, loose clothing, take as much clothes off as possible when you're transporting the person. And the sign of heat stroke is when someone is confused, their skin is red, but it's dry. And if you touch the
Mm.
skin, it's very, very hot as well. They can have fits, for example. Convulsions is often associated with it. They often speak in tones that you can't really understand. They have stomach cramps, they might even vomit, they complain of leg pain, they're tired, and they are just not feeling well. So those are the extremes of heat illnesses that we refer to, that we obviously initially try to prevent by not being exposed to it, and then treat as soon as possible.
Okay, a few questions before I let you go. They might be stupid questions, but I'm going to ask them nevertheless. You talk about hydrating, and I'm wondering, people seem to think immediately of energy drinks. Would cold water, not ice cold water, but cool water with a bit of sugar or salt, or a combination of both, or just maybe a little bit of sugar, will that be able to do the trick if you want to be rehydrated, uh,
Yeah.
speedily in a short space of time?
There's absolutely no such thing as a stupid question, so don't worry. It's actually very, very relevant.
I have a
Um,
few more. Let me throw them all at
yes.
you.
Okay.
How do we keep infants and babies, because they're unable to verbalize the discomfort that they're experiencing. So the best method for them. I've also read, and we all often been, it might be an old wives' tale, I don't know, is we're always told don't sit on the air conditioner, or don't sit too cold to the air conditioner, or don't put it on ice cold, for example, because you're going to catch a cold. Now, my understanding is you catch a cold or flu through a virus. And I'm kind of trying to understand, why should I not sit close to an aircon or a fan? Is that going to give me a cold? And then you talk about ice packs under the armpits, etc. Why not on the head? Is that going to have an adverse effect? So if you could respond to those
Okay.
questions.
Let's start with the first question, and that's probably the easiest one. Yes, firstly, yeah, and I'm not referring to heat stroke. Now I'm talking just about feeling tired.
Hydrating. Mhm.
Yeah, just hydrating. Water is probably the best. If you're sweating a lot, then clearly you need to replace electrolytes. The simplest way of doing it is taking a quarter teaspoon of salt in a liter of water. That's standard. You can add sugar to it to make it a bit more palatable. What I find is that it doesn't taste nice. So simply taking water and a salty snack, anything that contains a little bit of salt that's palatable for wheat bix or whatever food you want to consume that's got a bit of salt in it, with water on its own is perfect. Absolutely nothing to go even more calorie-wise or electrolyte-wise than that. So a quarter teaspoon of salt
A
in water,
liter.
with a liter of water with salt is a standard one. You can even throw half, but most people find a quarter to be palatable. And then sipping it as much as possible. Again, there's always in excessive cases, make sure you don't overhydrate. But if you're feeling thirsty, obey your thirst. Drink as much as possible then in such circumstances. So that's the first question. Electrolyte and energy drinks, there's no harm in using them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only answer. The simpler ways are much, much easier to access and simpler to use. As far as babies are concerned, we must remember that they have a much larger surface body compared to adults. So they sweat easier. They lose water, for example, much easier from their body, but they also radiate heat much easier. So the way to ascertain, especially in young children, I mean infants, for example, is if they're crabby and if they are very listless, they're not interacting easily, it will be something for concern. If a mother knows about child well, the fontanelle, which is in front of a baby, right in front, often easy to feel. If that is depressed, it could indicate that there's some form of dehydration. But children who are very non-cooperative when they normally are, who are not interacting with adults, that is a sign of concern. And again, hydrating them as frequently as possible is absolutely, absolutely paramount. Children, like you've already said, don't verbalize. It is in our hands to make sure that they're actually well looked after. And you didn't ask this question, but I just want to talk about the adults, the older adults as well. Those who are at the highest risk are babies, like you've rightfully mentioned, but also the older adults. They often don't feel the need to take water, for example. They don't. Their thirst response is often reduced. They also don't verbalize that easily. They're often on medication that prevents their response to dehydration, prevent their response to heat exposure to be optimal, and they often suddenly just collapse. So it's important for other adults around older older people to ensure that we actually keep an eye on them. And we often use a strategy on Arafah, for example, during Hajj time, where we assign a younger person to just keep an eye on an older person, just to make sure that they're okay, ask them not to stand for so long, especially during peak Arafah time, like the time of Wukuf, for example, where the temperature can go up to 50 degrees. Often people want to stand and with their hands outstretched, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, like I've just mentioned, and they often collapse. So we use this buddy system And this should also be implemented during heat wave times in a country such as South Africa, where there's often other adults or children in the house who can just keep an eye on the elderly people. Thirdly, you absolutely right that a virus or bacteria causes a cold or infection. So the sitting too close to an aircon is not going to predispose you to that. I think it's just coincidental. We don't advise people to sit too close because you don't want your temperature to go up and then, to go down, your surface temperature because you're sitting too close to it. Then you go outside, your temperature goes high up again, you come back in. Alterations in temperatures and fluctuations like that is also not good standard medical practice.
Okay, you spoke about overhydrating also being bad, and one or two more questions I have to put to you, please, before I let you go. So please indulge me just for another
Anything.
minute or two, if you don't mind.
Yes.
What about sports people? We need to look at them. What's the advice we're going to give to them in heat wave situations? The issue of the ice on the head, you still need to respond to.
Yes,
And
sorry.
then, no problem. And then you also mentioned that black and dark colors attract the heat. And yet, alhamdulillah, when we go on Hajj, we ladies especially wear black abayas in that heat. I'm just wondering about that dynamic.
Yes, the reasons for putting the ice packs under the armpits, under the neck, is that's where you can radiate. You can lose the heat the quickest. So you want to get
Okay.
rid of excess heat as fast as possible, and those are the areas where the groin, the under the armpits, and behind the neck, and even right around, where you will be able to lose that heat as fast as possible. Yes, you can put it everywhere else as well if people want that. So that's the answer. Sorry, I forgot to answer that question. The second one that you asked about
The
is
danger of overhydration.
yes, for sports people. Now, if you overhydrate, your electrolytes go into imbalance. For example, if you just drink pure water all the time, your sodium levels go down. Low sodium levels can cause confusion, can cause stomach cramps, and can cause more serious problems, conduction defects later on if it's quite severe. So, how to prevent overhydration is not to stick to what people say, drink a 500 mils every 500 meters, for example, if it's a sports person, but rather to obey your thirst. If you feel thirsty, you drink. If you don't feel thirsty, you just sip as you go along, making sure that you're taking in some electrolytes as well. So if you can alternate, for example, between a water sachet when you're running. Then, when you feel thirsty again, you can take a electrolyte containing one. The next one, you can take water again. So those are the strategies that can be put in place. How do we advise sports people if they know, for example, that they're going to a country, and let's use Hajj as an example. We know we're going to be exposed to high heat. So what we advise people then is go as early as possible, if possible. I mean, it's not always possible, but if people can afford it and if they have enough leave, go as early as possible to get acclimatized, because that's probably the best adapting mechanism that a person can have. So that's one particular way of doing it. Secondly, is if you want to race and you know it's going to be in a hot place, increase gradually your exposure to the sun, not suddenly. So if you know you're going to be running in a place that's got 40-degree temperatures, increase your exposure to it over a gradual period, a week, sometimes even 2 weeks, so that your body adapts. It's a sudden changes that the body cannot always adapt with. Thirdly, the question about the dark clothing, it's again not only the color of the clothing, it's also the thickness, like I've
Oh, the
mentioned. So
fabric. Yep.
yes, it's the thickness, it's how loose it is, because if you have circulation, it's fine. But white clothing is during the times of Hajj, would be infinitely better than black ones in heat wave conditions. What we often have a problem of ladies collapsing, where we have to take off layer after layer of clothing, and that is, that is can be quite dangerous. So most people will know what the temperature is going to be like, and well, then dress appropriately. And of course, if it suddenly gets cold, have something additional in your backpack and so forth. But The three L's, like I've mentioned, as light as possible in fabric, as loose as possible, and then, of course, the color, the lighter, the better.
Dr. Salim Parker, thank you indeed for that very, very valuable advice. We hope and pray we're not going to hear about any further fatalities this time around under this current heat wave in our country. And I suppose of concern are the farm workers and gardeners and people who work outdoors. Of concern, we need to make sure that they are hydrated and well protected. Thank you indeed once again. Keep us in your du'as, and salamu alaikum to you.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Time for me to wrap up. Thank you indeed for your company this morning. It is 18 after 10 o'clock. I do hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I've enjoyed your company. A big thank you to our producer, Nasreen Naidu, and our controller, Matthew Polani. Thanks for running the show. And from me, it is Khuda Hafiz till next Monday at the same time.